So I thank you, Mr. Druery. I do welcome you to our public inquiry today. Now, for the benefit of Hansard, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Glenn Druery, and I was invited here by the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Druery. I understand that you'd like to make an opening statement, please go to that statement.
Okay. I analyse voting systems just like Anthony Green, Malcolm McKerris, George Williams and Tim Bonham, who you heard from earlier. But unlike them, I advise people who start up political parties, small parties with ordinary people. Minor parties are merely dealing with the system that's been handed to them from the major parties. They're small, so they benefit from getting advice from people like me. The current system was introduced in 1984 to deal with Australia's very high informal voting rate, and it largely fixed that. All the major parties have exchanged preferences with each other in a way to improve their chances in the past. These days, they seem to have a problem when small parties do the same thing and actually get elected. I'm not claiming that the system is perfect, which is why I favour the adoption of a system similar to that used in the Victorian Legislative Council. This involves numbering 6 below the line and one above the line with a group voting ticket. The current system has advantages, and that we'll see disappear under the proposed changes. We have diversity in our parliament. Changing the rules to exhaust roughly 25% of the vote doesn't address the issue that major parties are less popular today than they have ever been. These changes are being sold to us as reform to improve democracy. But even if they were, there's no getting away from the fact that the legislation is about a tactical shifting of power. It's almost a form of electoral schoolyard bullying, or we don't want people like Ricky Muir playing in our sandpit. In a sense, the Greens and Xenophon got infant industry support in the form of a group voting ticket. Now they want to remove that support for others. In the future, the coalition will be the only party able to hold the Senate in its own right. Labor can't possibly achieve that. These changes may force the Labor Party into a formal coalition with the Greens in response. It also represents a cynical grab for power on the part of Senator Xenophon.
Order. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Druery.
These proposed changes are designed to exclude ordinary Australians from the political process. It will put us on track for a US and UK-style two-party system, a characteristic of the first-past-the-post electoral regimes. This could cause a Trump-Clinton-style polarisation. People don't like to be ignored in Australia. The Greens have also I believe the Greens have walked into a coalition snare. These changes may benefit them in a half-Senate election, but might not benefit them in a double dissolution election. It would be interesting to be a fly on the wall in the Greens' party room as they rearrange their pre-selection deck chairs. The unions are likely to walk away from the Greens. As part of a double dissolution joint sitting, we'll see the passage of the ABCC and the registered organisations legislation. All I can say is caution. This legislation seems to be rushing through this committee in half a day, so please be careful.
Thank you, Mr. Druery, for your opening statement. So we'll now move to questions, and consistent with previous witnesses, we'll rotate the call of approximately 5 minutes, and I believe we've allocated 40 minutes for this witness. Mr. Druery, you made the point in your statement that the behaviour of parties in these various complex preferencing deals is clearly lawful under the current system, and that's no doubt the case. The question I think that is important to get your view on is, do you think it's right that that's the way the system works? And do you think it's right that, according to testimony we've heard today, there's very minimal transparency to the average voter in terms of how their preferences are allocated? And do you think that's right?
Well, look, what I think is right is the fact that we have somebody over here in the form of Ricky Muir, who is what I like to term an ordinary person entering this place. Sure, the system's not perfect.
Thank you, Senator.
I'm dealing with the question.
Thank you.
The system isn't perfect, and I think that there is scope for improvement, as I suggested in my opening statement. But I would hate to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater, indeed the entire bathroom thrown out the door, simply to stop what is effectively a system that allows people who are not in the major parties to come into this place.
So just to be clear, so when you say allows that to occur, it's correct, isn't it, that it allows that to occur through a complex system of preference allocation which the average voter doesn't understand at the point at which they place their vote? That's a fair comment, isn't it?
That is a fair comment, but it's a system that wasn't put there by minor parties. It was put there by the major parties and has been tinkered with by the major parties effectively for about 100 years. So
the issue, I think, before the committee is if we have a system currently where I think that most of the witnesses before the committee today have acknowledged is not overly transparent or well understood by the average voter. The question is, can that be improved? And that's obviously what this legislation seeks to do. Is it your view that it is preferable for these preference deals to ultimately determine the outcome of who's elected to the Senate relative to a system where the voter themselves chooses to allocate their preferences above the line? You think I think you can have both. Mm-hmm. I'm not suggesting the Victorian system is the ideal system, but it's pretty good. Mm-hmm. It's not difficult for anybody to vote 1 to 6 below the line or 1 to 12 in a double dissolution election, with the option of ticking every box if you wish, and a simple 1 above the line. I think that Senator Day said earlier today, what's wrong with people who trust their parties to vote 1 above the line? Honestly, I think in this case we can have our cake and eat it too. 6 below the line or 1 above the line. And you also made, in your opening remarks, some comments about the diversity of the parliament, that being a good thing. Isn't it fair to say that the proposal would certainly allow individual voters to preference parties in any order that they determine? So should they determine that a particular party should be allocated their first preference, another one second, another one third, and so on, to their heart's content, really, in terms of the number. That's what this system would provide for, wouldn't it?
Well, in theory, yes, but look at the New South Wales system and what actually happens there. Most people just vote 1. The last election we saw for the first time, or second time actually, where preferences have made a big difference, and the Animal Justice Party were elected on, as I recall, about 1.9% round figures. The reality is, in the majority of elections, that ordinary people will be excluded if you adopt the system that this committee is, I think, going to recommend.
But just to be clear, Mr. Druery, if a voter chooses to preference any party whatsoever, regardless of whether it's a mainstream party, a small party, medium-sized party, any party, they're able to do that under the proposal, of course, and they are able to determine in their own mind what the appropriate allocation of preferences is as in between those different parties. That's right, isn't it?
And what I'm advocating is that they should be able to do that below the line, but we can still vote 1 above the line. We can have our cake and we can eat it too.
And so you don't think it's appropriate that above the line, when choosing between parties, that voters... thank you, Senator Conroy. That you don't think it's appropriate that when choosing between parties above the line, that voters should be able to allocate preferences as they see fit. You don't think that's appropriate?
Look, we can change the laws and make them more draconian if you wish, that it exclude everybody other than those in the coalition, the Labor Party. But I think we must have a system that allows diversity. And if we go down the road of some form of optional preferential above the line, we'll stop that. So what's wrong with optional preferential below the line and simple 1 above the line?
All right, thank you, Mr. Druery. I think my time has elapsed. Senator Conroy? Senator Conroy, so we move to Senator Rhiannon.
Did you want to go?
Unless Senator
Labor?
Brown or...
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Druery. In the lead up to the 1999 New South Wales state election, how many parties did you help form?
Look, that was a long time ago. I don't recall how many people I advised, but there was a lot.
So there was 81 parties. You helped register many of them. You actually had expected to get elected from comments you made at the time. So could you give more of an indication of...
I don't recall comments. What comments were they?
Well, but to ask the question again, how many parties were you involved in setting up? 20, 30, 40?
Look, I don't recall.
Most of them.
Certainly since then, I think I've been involved in helping people form over 40 political parties.
Over 40.
And there's a few at the moment.
So those political parties are parties designed to play a role in the group voting tickets. They're not parties, and this is a question, I'm not making assumptions here, I'm just saying, is it a political party that's got real members, that's got a platform, that's out there engaging with the public to win support, or are they parties that have been set up to be part of a group voting ticket to funnel votes?
Look, you'd have to talk to the parties about that.
But you've said you've helped set up 40 parties, so
yes.
You could obviously give an indication about that, Mr. Druery.
Look, I would be betraying private conversations, but I can say that the minor party operatives are a very eclectic bunch, and political parties are established for all sorts of reasons. Some of them think they can win. Some of them want to make statements in the political arena by simply running and getting access to the media. Others want to run in lower house seats and use their preferences to influence their positions. So I can't address your question specifically because I simply don't know the answer.
So can you address specifically, have you been paid to undertake this work? Is it true that you were paid by the shooters and fishers to undertake this work, to assist to set up parties to funnel votes to benefit from group voting tickets?
Senator Rhiannon, I don't think that is relevant to the inquiry.
I think it's highly relevant, Chair, because Mr. Druery has been one of the key people involved in using group voting tickets, and at the essence of this legislation, at the centre of the legislation we have before us is the removal of group voting tickets. So how Mr. Druery works is obviously very relevant, and if Mr. Druery could answer the question, it would be helpful.
Senator Rhiannon, I've obtained advice from the Secretariat on this point, and it is not appropriate to ask Mr. Druery in relation to his personal financial matters. You can ask him about people he's represented and so on in the past.
Thank you. It is. I think it should be recorded that Senator Conroy was supporting me on this one, but we will.
You should be able to ask questions.
We will move on. Is it true, in your view, that the more parties that are registered and part of a grouping of parties exchanging preferences via group voting tickets, the greater the chance that one of them will be elected?
Mathematically, that theory would be correct, yes.
So that's been the basis of how you have worked in terms of running those forums and running the round robins that you have organised to inform people that they have a chance of getting elected. So that's the basis of it?
No, that's not the basis.
So what is the basis, please?
Minor parties should work together, in my opinion, before they deal with the major parties. And my advice to minor parties is to, where they can, exchange preferences amongst themselves. Obviously, there are sometimes philosophical reasons why that can't happen, and some of those parties will preference major parties of varying colours before they go to other minor parties. I think you're referring to the Minor Party Alliance meetings that I've been running or hosting since 1999, is that right?
Yeah, no, that's what if you can provide.
These meetings are predominantly networking opportunities for minor parties.
And do you concede that it is a flawed electoral system if it provides an incentive for a person to register lots of parties because that provides electoral advantage?
As I recall, Senator, it was this so-called flawed electoral system that put you there in the first place, and quite a few, as I recall, political parties were set up by Greens sympathisers leading up to the 1990 election.
Well,
do you remember that, Senator?
No, absolutely not.
Mr.
I mean, you are again being deceptive and not answering the questions.
I'm not being deceptive.
You've got the examples, put them on.
Order.
In 1999,
Senator Rhiannon,
the Wilderness Party, the Animal Liberation Party you created, and you still won't put it on the record.
What about the euthanasia referendum party that Green supporters...
You've talked about ordinary members.
What about the parties that your supporters...
Mr. Druery, could you Senator Rhiannon, Senator Rhiannon, please address your question to Mr. Druery. Mr. Druery, your role is to answer the questions.
Mr. Druery, you have said in your you said in some of your opening remarks and to earlier questions your commitment to ordinary Australians being involved in the political process, and you're concerned that the changes will exclude ordinary Australians from the political system.
Most likely, yes.
Don't ordinary Australians have a right to decide their preferences?
Yes, they
rather
do,
than backroom
and that's why
deals?
I advocate 1 to 6 below the line.
Well, above the line, why do you not support a system where preferences will be required to be allocated up
Do you
to
mean
6?
the system that actually
I'll just
elected
finish
you?
my
Is that
question,
what you mean?
please. I will just finish my
last
question,
question,
please.
Senator.
The proposal for above the line is to allocate preferences to 1 to 6. Clearly, we all know that that would require people to also be preferencing minor parties. So here we have ordinary people deciding their preferences, and they can be electing minor parties. If we have real parties engaging in a political process on their election platform, engaging with people rather than getting out of the backroom deals. Isn't that the way to have ordinary people voting and determining their preferences and ordinary people being elected?
Thank you,
The
Senator.
reality of the situation is, Senator, you benefited from a form of electoral subsidy when you were elected, and now you are in the room. We'll pull up the drawbridge. It's unlikely that minor parties will make it through the system the way you did, the way that Senator Xenophon did. If you adopt a 1 to 6 above the line or 1 to whatever above the line, it will exclude minor parties.
All right, thank you. No, Senator Rhiannon, your time has elapsed.
I don't have a business
Senator
model.
Rhiannon, your time has elapsed.
Minor parties equate to minor money, I can assure you.
Thank you, Senator Rhiannon. Order, thank you. We now move on to the crossbench time allocation. Senator Day.
Thank you. Words like, or phrases like gaming the system and preference harvesting seem to be fine for 30 years whilst those preferences ended up with the majors. Isn't it the case that the minor parties and independents just got a lot better at preference arrangements than the major parties?
I won't single out any of the major parties as to how well they negotiate, but I mean, there's a little bit of talent there, but it could be better. Look, Senator, you're right. The system that we've had in place has been there for a long time to benefit the major parties, and we see that. We see that with until the Democrats came along and then the Greens, which now, by the way, are part of the political corporate mainstream, and they've walked well away from their grassroots.
Order. Senator Rhiannon, Senator Conroy, could we please listen to the witnesses' responses?
Yes, I think it is a case that minor parties have developed an understanding in recent times of how the system works, and we see good people such as yourself and Senator Lanehelm and Muir as a representation of that sitting there now, contributing toward what I believe is a very mature democratic process that does allow ordinary people to enter the political system. Right now in the US, we see a two-party state, and I would ask people like a rhetorical question, Senator Rhiannon, you don't have to answer this. Do we want to go down the route of the US? Do we want a two-party state? I would think that most Australians would say no.
Okay.
Senator Day.
Thank you.
Senator Muir or Lanehelm? Senator Muir.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks, Mr. Druery. Do I have to declare an interest about now, or no? I think I bypassed that bit.
Well, if you've paid him money,
In the beginning, the
paid him money.
no.
Thank
you're
you.
Quite
Order.
right.
Order. Thank you, Senator Muir. Please, thank you, Senator O'Sullivan. Senator Muir, please address your question to Mr. Druery.
In the opening, the Chair asked if the current system can be improved. Is this half-day Senate committee, which had over 100 submissions, which closed last night, sufficient enough to discuss real reform to a 30-year-old process?
The decisions made here, or the recommendations made here, could impact legislation that the Australian community will be dealing with for decades to come. I suggested in my opening statement that this was a tactical move on the part of the coalition. I firmly believe that. I could talk about the polls and how the Prime Minister is going down in the polls, and it would be to his advantage to go to a double dissolution, but I won't talk about that. But others do talk about that, and we are well aware that there are many people within the government that have leaked dates in early July for an election. So I would go so far as to say if the Greens listen to their supporters and back out of this deal that they've been hoodwinked into, that we probably will not go to a double dissolution, and it will be a tactical failure for the coalition.
Senator Muir.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. What effect will the savings provisions have on voters who put their faith in minor parties to direct their preferences for them?
That's a good question, Ricky. I think little effect.
Yeah. So do you think those minor parties, those who might want to vote for the hemp party or something, would their vote exhaust if somebody goes and accidentally votes one above the line?
We can see from the New South Wales example that there is quite a high exhaustion rate. I believe that if we adopt the system that's being discussed here today or something similar, that we will have a very high exhaustion rate. Something over 3 million voters voted for parties other than the majors at the last election. That could well be closer to 4 million this time if we look at the trends. And quite a large percentage of those people will effectively be voting for nobody.
So just to explain to the public, it's your interpretation of the proposal with the above the line, that if somebody went one above the line to a minor, it would exhaust there and go no further?
Yes, let's just say we voted for the XYZ party and they pulled 0.1 of a quota, if we could just use a number. That 0.1 of a quota is very likely to exclude. And if you multiply that over 20 or 30 parties, then you can see we're getting into quite substantial numbers.
Just for the ease of the listener in there who doesn't quite understand the current system in place, do the major parties have to deal with preferences?
Do the major parties deal preferences?
Yes.
You mean under this proposed system?
Under the current system?
Oh, certainly. It's compulsory preferential voting in the current system.
Thank you.
They do, yes.
Yeah.
And might I say, over the years, some of them have used that very well. In my experience, in recent times, the Greens have had some very good operators. And many people argue that it was certain personalities in the Democrats that caused their failure. It may well have been, but certainly the tactical moves on the part of the Greens behind the scenes in backroom deals contributed to that.
All right. Well, thank you, Senator Muir. Thank you. That's our time allocation for the crossbench. All right. So I'll just follow up, if I may, Mr. Druery, with a couple of questions. I just want to come back to this central point. I think one of your arguments is that that minor parties are, potentially disadvantaged by these changes. I think the point I just want to focus on is, if somebody wants to vote for a minor party, and if somebody walks in to a polling place and says, look, I want to vote for XYZ and I want to allocate 1 to 10 or whatever as they may be, that's what this legislation provides for, isn't it? And to the extent that it disadvantaged a party, that could only really occur if the voter in fact chose not to vote for that party, couldn't it?
Yes.
And why is that a bad thing?
I think that anything that takes away diversity in the parliament is a bad thing. And that's why I come back to the, if you like, have your cake and eat it too option, and that is what you're suggesting, below the line. But for those that wish to vote above the line, they can simply vote 1 above the line. Now, with an education process, I think that could work very, very well. You could explain through the AEC and other organisations, if you wish to nominate your own preferences, you do so below the line. Not numbering every box that we have at the moment, that can be tedious, although I do that every election, but simply 1 to 6 or 1 to 12 in a full Senate election. And if those that wish to vote above the line and trust their parties, then do so. Vote 1 with a GVT.
But why is it a problem for the purposes of voting above the line for the voter to have the opportunity to choose from the full gamut of parties and determine, based on their own views, how those parties should be preferred?
Why is it a problem having choice? And I'm advocating choice.
So yes, but not with respect to the allocation of preferences above the line. You're not advocating choice.
Well, there's a big black line there, and I'm advocating that people have a choice below the line. They can preference whomever they wish, but they can also vote 1 above the line and trust their party to direct their preferences.
All right. Mr. Druery, you made some comments before just around I think in response to one of the questions about the talents or the issues involved in managing these quite complex. Senator Rhiannon, have order, please. In managing these quite complex preference deals. Now, I understand that's something you obviously have some expertise in. Is that a process that is something that you're obviously quite familiar with?
Am I familiar with the preference system? Is that what you're asking me?
No, the process of allocating the preference deals, so to speak.
Oh, I have an understanding of it, yes.
Okay. And to the extent that this legislation proceeds, what would be the role for those complex sort of behind closed doors preference deals? To what extent would that be affected by this legislation?
Well, I mean, let's see the colour of the legislation, as I
Based on the
understand
draft.
it would remove, if the group voting ticket is removed, then largely many of the negotiations over preference deals would change, certainly, yes.
So,
well, that's a
thank
different
you,
story.
So
That's a very different story.
So just to be clear, so if the legislation in its current form passed the Parliament, the requirement for those existing complex preference deals and so on would be lesser because the voter themselves would be allocating the preferences. Is that right?
There would still be preference arrangements in place, and that could look like this. For example, the Greens may do a deal with the Labor Party, perhaps, and that might see voters directed on the how to vote card, vote 1 ALP, 2 Green, 3 whomever. Similarly,
Yes.
the coalition may do a deal with, who would you like to do a deal with? The Christian Democrats? And 1 coalition, 1 Liberal National, 2 coalition, and so on and so forth. So certainly negotiations would not end. There would be a form of negotiations continue, and often these negotiations are clouded with what goes on in the lower house. And I'm very well aware that deals have been in place for many elections between the Greens and the ALP, where Greens demand ALP preferences in the Senate. In response, the Greens will preference the ALP in certain lower house seats. So look, negotiations will not end. They will change, but they will not end.
So I'm just about to pass the call to you, Senator Conroy. Just last question. So just to be clear, whilst it would obviously be possible for parties to allocate particular preference deals or allocations in their how to vote cards for above the line, as you allude to, the formal allocation of preferences in a somewhat mechanical fashion as exists now when someone votes 1 would not occur anymore, and it would be up to the voter as to whether or not they adopted that preference allocation as recommended by their chosen party. Is that right?
The mechanical positioning would be such that the voter would have to actually mark numbers or ticks or squares or whatever in boxes.
Yes. Thank you. All right. Give the call to Senator Conroy.
Mr Green indicated his analysis, and I'll try and use the exact words, of voting under the new system. It would be much more likely that the Liberals would get 38 in the Senate. In your view, would any minor parties, other than Senator Xenophon, who is a South Australian phenomenon, shall we say, any other minor parties survive in this voting system?
It's unlikely, and it's unlikely that any minor parties will be born, if you like. We saw the growth of the Nick Xenophons, the Greens, the Democrats, and as I suggested in my opening speech, with a system that offered some form of protection, if you like, to help small parties become established until they were, well, in the Greens' case, moved away from their grassroots and more part of the mainstream, and now they no longer need that protection. In my view, it is unlikely we will see that develop into the future, and it is very likely that we will ultimately move to a 2.5 party state. Xenophon, I believe, made an unfortunate choice of name when he put his name in it, and when he eventually retires, I think his party will retire with him. Certainly, forever is a long time in politics, but in the foreseeable future, assuming Xenophon stays around, it will be the Greens in some type of coalition with the ALP. They will be forced into that, because the ALP under these changes will very rarely, if ever, have control of the Senate in their own right. The only organisation, the only group that will be able to do that will be the coalition. Will that happen in every election? Unlikely. Every second, third, fourth cycle? Who knows? But it will certainly happen.
But in terms of a blocking majority at 38...
the Coalition's the only group that can do that on their own. You may see a situation where there is a balance of power position with the Greens, and so the ALP or Xenophon, Coalition, Xenophon, Greens, I mean, these things shift around a lot, as you know.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Rhiannon, did you want to ask any further questions? Or,
No, I'm right, thank you.
All right, we'll pass on the call to the crossbench. Senator Lundhelm.
Yes, the comparison with New South Wales Legislative Council has been drawn a couple of times today, and in after the 1999 election we saw abolition of group voting tickets in New South Wales. What has been the impact on diversity in the New South Wales Parliament as a consequence of that change, and why, explain why has that occurred?
We do draw comparisons with New South Wales, and this system that's being advocated is somewhat similar to New South Wales. However, there's one big difference, and that is that New South Wales has 21 members that are elected, thereby the quota is 4.5%. We have 6 individuals elected in the Senate, or 12 in the full Senate, but the quota is dramatically higher. So, albeit we have a system that is biased toward the major parties in New South Wales, like this proposed system, it does make it much easier for smaller parties to enter the process in New South Wales because the quota is so much less. So in terms of what does it mean for diversity in New South Wales, well, we have, of course, the Coalition represented, the Labor Party, the Greens, the Shooters and Fishers Party, Christian Democrats, and recently the Animal Justice Party. Did I get them all?
And this is my final question. Where do you, in relation to the preference deals that will be discussed in terms of this new proposed or this new intended legislation, so what will occur on the how to vote cards, who will discuss those preference deals, and where will those discussions occur, do you think?
Do you want me to use the term back room?
It could be back room.
Or coffee shop, or
Could be.
over lunch somewhere, because that's how it happens now. All of the parties have these preference negotiators, and I'll use it again, these backroom deals have been going on forever, and they will continue.
Thank you.
Thank you,
all.
Senator
Thank you,
Lundhelm. Senator Muir, did you have any further questions? All right, I'll pass the call to Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your testimony, Mr Druery. I just want to pick up a few points with your discussions with Senator Rhiannon. You said that earlier on that you're paid to advise on the Senate voting systems, and you're paid by political parties.
Oh, I didn't say that. Senator Rhiannon did.
So it would not be fair to say, so you provide this advice for free? You're not actually paid by political parties or individuals?
Much of the advice I provide is for free, yes.
But that's not my question. So my question was, is this
Senator
free
Reynolds,
advice or paid advice?
Senator Reynolds, we have advice from Senator Conroy. Senator Reynolds, order,
Chair, I'll
order,
rephrase
Senator
it.
Rhiannon.
So you have clients? So, Mr Druery, you have clients?
No. Senator O'Sullivan has a point of order, yes.
Just point of order on your ruling. I think this very question is a significant question and goes to the heart of how much weight someone like me on this committee can give to the evidence of this witness. He's either a paid player or he's not. Well, the others haven't hidden behind it. We know that they're paid to provide their advice to their political parties. So
yeah, Senator O'Sullivan, thank you. Senator Carr, thank you. I have
he hasn't said that.
Order. Senator O'Sullivan, thank you. I have obtained advice from the Secretariat on this specific issue, and the Secretariat advises that those questions are not in order. You can, of course, ask Mr Druery about his professional expertise in this area.
Well, I didn't actually write down the words, but you said that you provided advice to over 40 political parties. Is that correct?
Oh, it'd be many more than that.
Okay. How many political parties have you advised on Senate voting practices?
I'd have to refer to notes, but since 1999, I don't know, over 100.
Okay, so somewhere over 100. How many of those parties? So you talked about having some of these parties, nurture them till they can survive and thrive on their own. So how many of those 100 parties would still be in existence now?
I looked at some numbers about a year or so ago, and they of course have changed. So this is just an in principle answer that I give you. As I recall, from 1999, over 250 minor political parties have been registered at state and federal level. Of that, within 2 to 3 electoral cycles, the overwhelming majority of them...
Sorry, Mr Druery, you misunderstood my question. In terms of the 100 or plus that you have personally advised, how many of those, not the all 250, of the hundreds that you've been involved in?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
I'm not asking about an analysis of all political parties, just the 100 or so that you have advised.
Look, it's probably well over 100. When I say advised, I've been running meetings for minor parties that the press referred to as the Minor Party Alliance since 1999. At the very first Minor Party Alliance meeting, there was 50 groups. At the last meeting, what was it, 3 or 4 months ago, there was probably 45 groups. So certainly the figure of 100 is an underestimation. It could be... I honestly don't recall.
The answer is you're not quite sure how... You can't give me the precise number of how many of the...
Well, you ask about advice. Advice is me standing up in front of a room with perhaps 100 individuals representing 30 or 40 political parties, and I talk about how the system works. That's advice.
Okay. Now, at what point... we've had some testimony here that suggests that in terms of the preference distribution, that you have parties who have a particular name, like, Forest Conservation or the Sex Party or whatever, and people actually look at that name and think that there must be some philosophical underpinning that reflects their name. So when you've been advising these 100-odd parties, Senator Carr, you were heard in silence.
Order. Senator Reynolds has the call.
At what point, when you provided...
Order. Senator Carr, Senator Conroy...
At what...
Senator Reynolds has the call and she will ask her question. Senator Reynolds has the call and she'll ask her question without interruption.
Mr Druery, thank you, Chair. At what point, Mr Druery, in these discussions, do you, when you're providing advice to these parties, consider the linkage between the party name and actually the party philosophy that underpins that political party, so that when voters are making a choice, if they're voting for the party, how do they know that party stands?
This is really a question for any given individual or group that comes to me. It's not a question for me. I will make suggestions on names, of course, but if somebody comes to me that represents, say, a Christian group...
Okay, so in your advice, in your advice, it's about how to manipulate the system. It's not about how to link or how to develop a philosophy. It's not about how to manipulate the system at all. Or a name. It's about how to work within the system that people like you have put there. When does the voter's intent, so when you're advising on how to do group voting tickets and do the preference deals...
Sorry, can you repeat the last one?
At what point do voters, like the people up in the gallery now, at what point does their will come into it?
Well, when they walk in to vote, their will comes into it. They can choose where they vote.
The time has elapsed, Senator Reynolds. Senator Reynolds, the time has elapsed, and in keeping with the resolution, we will conclude your questions at that time. The time for this witness has also elapsed, and Mr Druery, we do thank you very much for your testimony before the committee today.
Thank you for inviting me down.
That concludes today's public hearing. I thank all witnesses for providing evidence to the committee today, and I thank Hansard and Broadcasting. Approved transcript of today's proceedings will be posted on the committee's website. The committee is required to table its report in the Parliament tomorrow morning. This hearing is adjourned.